Picture this, it's Paris, 1789. The city is alive with unrest, the air thick with whispers of rebellion. The streets are filled with grumbling crowds, and something big is in the air. People are no longer whispering about reform, they're chanting about overthrowing the system, taking down centuries of royal power. This isn't a protest, this is the beginning of something that will shake the world to its core, the French Revolution. But what actually happened in 1789? What were the real causes behind the storming of the Bastille, the fall of the monarchy, and the rise of the revolutionaries? The usual narrative gives us the surface-level story: a king who couldn't control his country, a queen who was out of touch, and a bloodthirsty mob wanting change. But what if I told you that the truth is far more complicated and more surprising than we've ever been taught? This isn't just another history lecture. This is the untold story behind the French Revolution, and once you hear it, you'll never look at history the same way again. It's the late 18th century. France is a massive kingdom, rich in land, resources, and influence across Europe. But behind the glittering facade of Versailles and the extravagant lifestyle of its monarchs, there is a crisis that threatens to tear everything apart. The problem wasn't just one thing, it was a perfect storm of social inequality, financial mismanagement, and radical ideas circulating across Europe. At the heart of it all is a rigid social system. France is divided into three estates: the first estate, the clergy; the second estate, the nobility; and the third estate, everyone else. The third estate is by far the largest, comprising nearly 98% of the population. Yet, despite their numbers, they're powerless, burdened by heavy taxes, military service, and an unforgiving system that keeps them at the bottom of the social ladder. On the other hand, the first and second estates, the clergy and the nobility, live in luxury, exempt from taxes, and hold all the political power. To add fuel to the fire, these privileged classes didn't just have money, they had status, the right to hold land, and most importantly, control over laws that were designed to maintain their hold on power. Can you imagine living in a society like that? A place where no matter how hard you worked, no matter how much you contributed, you had no voice. Where those with power weren't even asked to sacrifice. That's the backdrop to the French Revolution, a kingdom that had reached its breaking point. So, why was the revolution sparked in the first place? Money. Or more precisely, the lack of it. France was in debt, and I'm not talking a little bit. The royal treasury was empty. But how did this happen? Wasn't France a rich, powerful kingdom? The thing is, France had been bleeding money for years. It wasn't just that King Louis XVI was an ineffective ruler, it was the long-term effects of decisions that had been made over decades. One of the biggest contributors to the debt was France's involvement in the American Revolution. In a bid to help the U.S. win its independence from Britain, France sent thousands of troops, ships, and weapons. It was a noble cause, but it came at a crushing cost. France spent so much money on the war that it bankrupted itself. The French monarchy had borrowed heavily from other countries, promising to pay it all back with interest. But the reality was, they had no way to meet those debts. Louis XVI, desperate, called for a meeting of the Estates General in 1789, hoping to fix the financial mess. The idea was simply to raise taxes on everyone, including the nobles and clergy, who had long been exempt. But the nobles were furious at the suggestion. They wouldn't allow it. And so, the real crisis emerged: the king had no real authority to fix the problem. Most of us think that the French Revolution was simply a response to poverty. Yes, the peasants were hungry and suffering, but the real spark came from a different group, the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie were the educated middle-class merchants, bankers, doctors, lawyers, and professionals who had money, but not the political power that came with being born into nobility. They had seen the success of the American Revolution and had begun to question the old system of monarchy and aristocracy that gave power to the elite. They were inspired by Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu, who argued for new ideas about democracy, individual rights, and the separation of powers. The bourgeoisie weren't just frustrated by their lack of influence, they were literate, educated, and connected to new political ideas that were challenging the status quo. But here's the twist: they didn't just want reforms, they wanted revolution. They believed that the old system, the monarchy and the nobility, was completely outdated. And they weren't the only ones. The peasants, especially those in rural France, were also struggling, and they joined forces with the bourgeoisie to demand something more than just a few changes. They wanted a complete overhaul of the entire system. Fast forward to May 1789. Louis XVI calls the Estates General to deal with the financial crisis. Representatives from each of the three estates gather to discuss the issues facing the kingdom. But there's a major problem. The third estate, the largest estate, representing the vast majority of the population, is outvoted at every turn. The nobility and clergy dominate, and it quickly becomes clear that the king is not interested in real reform. This is where things get interesting. The third estate, feeling snubbed, decides to take matters into their own hands. They walk out of the Estates General and declare themselves the National Assembly, the true representatives of the people of France. The king, who could have crushed them, instead hesitates. And this moment of hesitation is the beginning of the end for the old regime. In July of 1789, tensions boil over. The storming of the Bastille, the symbol of royal power, becomes the iconic moment that signifies the beginning of the revolution. People in Paris, who had been hearing rumors of the king planning to disband the National Assembly, took to the streets. They attacked the Bastille, hoping to seize weapons and ammunition for their cause. The fall of the Bastille is more than just an angry mob taking down a building, it's the symbolic fall of the monarchy's absolute power. When word spreads across the country, uprisings erupt in other parts of France, and the revolution begins to snowball. The monarchy can no longer maintain control. Now, here's where things get really dark. At first, the revolution was about freedom, liberty, and equality. But as the revolution progressed, things became more radical. The Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, took control. They believed that in order to protect the revolution, they had to eliminate anyone who was seen as a threat, even if that threat was just someone who disagreed with the direction of the revolution. What started as a fight for liberty quickly turned into the Reign of Terror. Thousands of people, including former revolutionaries, were arrested and sent to the guillotine. The idea was simple: if you're not with us, you're against us. And anyone who was suspected of being an enemy of the revolution was executed. It wasn't long before Robespierre himself, the architect of the terror, would fall victim to his own policies and be executed in 1794. The revolution had eaten itself. So, what came out of this chaos? A new France, yes. But not the idealized republic the revolutionaries had envisioned. The Directory that took control after the terror was weak, and France continued to struggle. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte, a military hero, would rise to power, eventually declaring himself emperor and ending the revolution once and for all. The French Revolution was more than just a series of events, it was a battle of ideas, a clash of old versus new. It was about the struggle for power, the fight for rights, and the consequences of radical change. And the truth is, it was far messier than we've been taught. The causes weren't just economic, social, or political, they were deeply philosophical. The revolutionaries were fighting for ideals that had never existed in practice before, a society where freedom, equality,